Magic the Gathering has been described as the most complicated game on Earth. That's why this podcast is here to break it down for you in an easy to understand way. Whether you know the basics of the game or can't even name one thing about it, this podcast will help you have a better understanding of the game's mechanics. Let's get started with a simple question. What is Magic the Gathering, or Magic for short? Magic the Gathering is a trading card game, or TCG. The first game that probably comes to mind is Pokemon, which has some similarities to Magic, but while trading is a part of any TCG, that is only a very small portion of the game, and does not affect the actual gameplay. TCGs are all different, but they have many things in common. In a normal board game, there's little to no customization, and everyone playing has the same pieces. But in a trading card game, players build their own decks out of cards that are already in the game. While this may seem daunting at first, there are many pre-constructed decks that you can buy that will get you started while you learn how to play. Now let's get started on how to actually play the game. The objective of Magic is to get your opponent's life total down to 0. Each player starts with 20 life, which is typically tracked using a 20-sided die. There are 7 cards in Magic, or 7 types of cards rather. Creatures, lands, instants, sorceries, artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalkers. I'll break each one down for you, starting with lands. Lands can add mana, which is kind of the life force of Magic. You can't play anything without it. To do this, you tap the land, which I will explain later. Tapping the land adds mana to your mana pool. There are 5 types of mana or colors in Magic: green, white, blue, black, and red. Each color has its own playstyle, but this is not super important to know, but a deck can have any number of these colors in it. Let's talk about how to actually play a card before we get back into the card types, now that you know how lands work. Let's say you want to place a card called Stormcrow. Stormcrow has a 1 symbol followed by a water drop. The 1 would mean 1 of any mana color, and the water drop means it requires a blue mana. For card types, let's start with creatures. Think of creatures as your minions that you've summoned to help attack your opponent. They have a certain attack and a certain health. This is called power and toughness. This is indicated on the bottom right of the card, power coming first. Enchantments are another card type. You play them, they do a specific thing for the rest of the game until something destroys them. Think of it as kind of a permanent effect. There are also enchantment auras that attach to a creature, but the card will specify if they can do this. Artifacts are similar to enchantments, they just tend to do different things. Like for example, some can add mana such as lands. They can also be attached to a creature if the artifact is an equipment, again it'll specify it. Sorceries are another card type. You play them, they do something, they go to your graveyard. Think of it as kind of like a one-time effect. Instants are just like sorceries, but they can be played at any time during the game, including your opponent's turn. Now the last and least common card type is planeswalkers. They enter the battlefield with a certain amount of loyalty counters. You can either subtract or remove the loyalty counters to do something. When the counters get to 0, the planeswalker is destroyed. You won't run into this card type a whole lot, but it's still good to remember. Now that you know how each card works, let's talk about how the turns of the game go. To set up a game, shuffle your deck and draw a hand of 7 cards and turn your 20-sided dice to 20. Before you learn how to attack, you'll need to learn the tapping mechanic, which I've talked about before with the lands. Tapping will basically mean that the card is out of use. To show that a card is tapped, you will turn it sideways. A land will tap after it's used, a creature will tap when it attacks, and anything else will tell you if it becomes tapped. Like lands, if you're gonna tap a land for mana, you would turn it sideways and tell your opponent that you're tapping it. Creatures do not enter tapped, but they can't attack on their first turn. Let's talk about the phases of your turn. To begin your turn, untap all of your cards that were tapped and draw a card. Next is your main phase. During this phase, you can play lands, cast creatures, spells, enchantments, whatever you want to cast. Following this phase is the combat phase. If you would like to attack your opponent, tell them what creatures you are attacking them with. These creatures tap. Note that you can only attack players and planeswalkers. You can't attack other creatures. Your opponent will tell you what they're blocking with. The creatures then deal damage equal to their power to the creature that's blocking them, and the blocking creatures deal damage equal to the creature that they're blocking. If the creature is blocked, then the opponent doesn't take damage from the attacking creatures. Then damage is dealt, and any creature that's toughness got to 0 goes to your graveyard. Following your combat is another main phase, where you can play cards again. At the end of your turn, you'll tell your opponent that you're done with your turn. Your creatures will heal if they were dealt damage, and you pass the turn to your opponent. Now you're almost ready to play. But first let's talk about some common keywords you might see on creatures. Keywords are a quick way of saying that a creature has an ability and it will always be indicated on the card. More obscure abilities have a description of what they do, but the most common ones usually don't, so you will need to memorize them. Starting off with Vigilance. Vigilance means that the creature doesn't tap when it attacks. So that means that it can block on the same turn that it attacked. Flying means that it can't be blocked except by other creatures with flying. Haste means that the creature can attack as soon as it played. Other creatures that don't have haste cannot attack. Death Touch means that any amount of damage done is enough to destroy a creature. For example, a creature with power 1 could kill a creature with 10 toughness if it had Death Touch. Trample means that the creature deals excess damage to the opponent. For example, if a creature with 12 power was being blocked by a creature with 1 toughness, the opponent would still take 11 damage. And that's the basics to Magic the Gathering. This probably seems like a lot of information, and my suggestion is this: just play the game. The more you play, the more you learn. There are plenty of great game stores in really any area that you live in, and these stores are a great place to meet new people and get better at the game.